Why did the mighty Soviet Union collapse? How did one of the world's superpowers crumble into oblivion? In this video, you'll find out everything there is to know about the USSR's downfall, along with lesser-known decisions taken by the Soviet leadership. It all began in March 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Soviet Union. He inherited a stagnant economy and embarked on a bold mission to revive it through a series of sweeping reforms. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, and Glasnost, translating to openness or transparency. But these brought along some unwanted consequences, fostering the emergence of nationalist movements. Pre-existing ethnic tensions started growing in intensity, indirectly leading to the revolutions of 1989. But we'll get to that later. After Gorbachev became General Secretary, he appointed people he trusted in important positions of the state. One such man was Boris Yeltsin, who was brought into the Central Committee and then became first secretary of the Moscow Communist Party. As time went on, Gorbachev continued his liberalization. In 1986, Andrei Sakharov returned to the USSR, despite being the most prominent Soviet dissident. In 1987, Gorbachev gave free speech to the press and liberated dozens of political prisoners. Also, at this time, the first openly anti-communist organizations started to form inside the Soviet Union. Along with their existence, protests started breaking out, from Latvia to Moscow and to the Kazakh Republic. At first, it seemed that these were isolated incidents, but they would prove to be the first signs of the impending Soviet collapse. In the summer of 1987, protests were organized in Latvia and Armenia, to which security forces responded mildly. The authorities did not crack down on demonstrators, which encouraged more and larger demonstrations, especially throughout the Baltic states. Also, the Soviet Union ceased to jam all foreign radio stations, allowing Soviet citizens to have unrestricted access to news sources beyond Communist Party control. As 1988 rolled on, the centralized administration of the USSR started to lose control of the Baltic republics, which were now leaning towards independence. One of the first countries to openly declare its national sovereignty was Estonia, who did so in November 1988. In the same year, the Caucasus started descending into violence and civil war. An open conflict started to form between the Soviet Republic of Armenia and the Republic of Azerbaijan. The Regional Soviet Council of Nagorno-Karabakh voted to join the Republic of Armenia, disregarding Central Soviet orders or authority. This led to widespread violence in the area, especially by Azerbaijanis against Armenians. In Azerbaijan and Armenia, things started to degenerate as protests gathered tens of thousands of participants. It was necessary for the Red Army to intervene in order to stop the violence. Furthermore, in late 1988, a massive earthquake struck Armenia and killed tens of thousands, contributing to the widespread chaos in the republic. Basically, the lack of national sovereignty fueled ethnic tensions in the Caucasus, while encouraging the Western movements of independence. The ethnic minorities inside the USSR never forgot the Soviet deportations and violence, especially in the Baltic region. As Gorbachev's liberal policies were now enforced, the Soviet authorities no longer had the power to suppress protests and rebellions. As such, national liberation movements started to gain ground. This would soon prove to be disastrous for the fate of the Soviet Union. In the spring of 1989, the Soviet Union saw its citizens participate in a limited democratic election for the first time since 1917, electing the new Congress of People's Deputies. This significant event also featured unprecedented live TV broadcasts of the legislature's sessions, showing communist leaders being held accountable. Gorbachev's policy of non-intervention also allowed Warsaw Pact countries to gain greater independence. These were satellite states of the Soviet Union from 1945, when the Iron Curtain descended upon Eastern Europe. This freedom of choice meant that Eastern European countries turned towards becoming democracies. Poland was the first to have a democratic regime, followed by other Eastern Bloc countries. Romania was the last one, experiencing a bloody and violent revolution which overthrew its communist leadership in December 1989. In the Baltics, a great victory was obtained by the Sonjudas, Lithuania's independent national movement. In the March 1989 elections for the Congress, 36 out of 42 candidates were members of the Lithuanian movement. This was the greatest victory for any national organization within the Soviet Union and highlighted the growing unpopularity of the Communist Party. In the Caucasus region, tensions escalated, resulting in widespread chaos in the Soviet republics of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. In all these republics, the leading political figures openly stated their goals of achieving independence, which they followed through all the means available, including riots, violence, and strikes. Significant protests also broke out in Ukraine and Moldova towards the end of 1989. Here, police and military authorities responded violently at first. The rebellious stance spread further towards the miners of Donbass and the Central Asian republics. In Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, people started attacking local police stations and rioted in cities. In response, Gorbachev sent in the Soviet army and replaced Gennady Kolbin with Nursultan Nazarbayev, who would guide Kazakhstan towards independence. He led the country until 2019. As 1990 began, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union gave up its monopoly on political power. Therefore, the door was open for democratic political movements of the Soviet republics. They rejected legislation that conflicted with local laws, asserted control over their local economies, and refused to pay taxes to the Soviet government. Also, a new power struggle started to take place between the already established Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. Nevertheless, all the struggle and chaos inside the Soviet Union benefited the small nations inside it, who now started to take advantage. On the 11th of March 1990, the newly elected parliament of the Lithuanian Soviet Republic proclaimed the Act of Re-establishment, making Lithuania the first Soviet republic to declare independence from the Soviet Union. Similar events took place in Estonia and Latvia, which started their own processes of gaining independence in the spring of 1990. After significant violence in Azerbaijan and Armenia, and a Soviet military intervention, the Caucasian republics managed to gain their independence in 1990 and 1991. Nevertheless, the region barely managed to gain periods of stability, as there were persistent conflicts between Georgia and Russia in later years, as well as Armenian-Azerbaijani wars regarding Nagorno-Karabakh. Bloodshed and chaos were also present in other Soviet republics in 1990, such as Ukraine and the Central Asian nations. These republics vividly fought for their independence and managed to gain it later on. The year of 1991 would prove to be of the utmost importance for the existence of the Soviet Union. On the 12th of June, Boris Yeltsin was elected president of the Russian Soviet Republic. Following his election, the Russian Republic declared itself autonomous from the Soviet Union. Yeltsin criticized central dictatorial control during his campaign, but did not initially advocate for a market economy. Faced with rising separatist movements, Mikhail Gorbachev sought to transform the Soviet Union into a less centralized federation of independent republics. The new Union Treaty aimed to achieve this by creating a federation with a common president, foreign policy, and military. Central Asian republics strongly supported the treaty due to the economic benefits of a common market. However, the treaty also implied continued Communist Party influence over economic and social matters, which did not sit well with radical reformists. Most Soviet leaders believed a swift transition to a market economy was essential, even if it resulted in the Soviet Union's disintegration. This aligned with the aspirations of Boris Yeltsin and regional authorities who wanted to eliminate Moscow's control. In contrast, conservatives, Russian nationalists, and the military opposed weakening the Soviet state and its centralized power. As tensions rose, a coup was organized in Moscow. On the 19th of August, 1991, in an attempt to prevent the signing of the new Union Treaty, some members of the political and military leadership of the U.S.S.R. formed the General Committee on the State Emergency. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest and severed his communications. The coup leaders issued an emergency decree suspending political activity and banned most newspapers. Thousands of Muscovites took to the streets to defend the Kremlin, the Russian Federation's parliament, and Yeltsin's office, which symbolized Russian sovereignty. The coup organizers failed to arrest Yeltsin, who rallied opposition by making speeches from the top of a tank. Special forces sent by the coup leaders took positions near the Kremlin, but refused to storm the building. The coup leaders also failed to jam foreign news broadcasts, allowing Muscovites to watch the events unfold live on TV. After 3 days, the coup collapsed. The organizers were detained, and Gorbachev was reinstated as president, although with significantly diminished power. Nevertheless, seeing that everything was falling apart, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as General Secretary of the Communist Party on the 24th of August, 1991. That same day, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic declared Ukraine's independence. 5 days later, the Supreme Soviet suspended all activity, effectively ending communist rule. The Soviet Union disintegrated rapidly between August and December 1991, with 10 republics seceding out of fear of another coup. By late September, Gorbachev's influence was confined to Moscow, where he faced challenges from Boris Yeltsin. On the 6th of November, Yeltsin banned all Communist Party activities in Russia, marking a clear shift in power. On the 8th of December, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belovezha Accords, declaring the Soviet Union dissolved and forming the Commonwealth of Independent States. Gorbachev denounced this as unconstitutional, but it reflected the reality that the USSR had effectively ceased to exist. On the 16th of December, Kazakhstan became the last republic to secede. 9 days later, on Christmas Day, Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union, ceding his powers to Yeltsin. That evening, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time and replaced with the Russian tricolor, symbolically ending the Soviet Union. The next day, the upper chamber of the Supreme Soviet formally voted the Soviet Union out of existence. By the end of 1991, the few remaining Soviet institutions ceased operations, and the newly independent republics assumed control. Russia took over the Soviet Union's United Nations membership and most of its assets, though disputes with Ukraine over state succession and external debts continued. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was completed with the adoption of a new Russian constitution in December 1993, formally marking the end of the Soviet era. Gorbachev's attempt to revive the Soviet Union ended as a complete fiasco. The Glasnost and Perestroika concepts turned out to encourage the Soviet Republic's independence. What started as a nationwide communist experiment in 1917 ended as an economic and social disaster in 1991 after successive attempts of stabilization. Finally, after the USSR collapsed, many of the former Soviet republics struggled economically and needed decades to find their footing. Nearly all of the post-Soviet states suffered deep and prolonged recessions, with poverty increasing more than tenfold. Furthermore, the breakup of the USSR unleashed a wave of social disintegration and political instability across the region. This turmoil fueled ethnic conflicts driven by social and economic disparities, as well as ethnic differences, leading to a surge in nationalism among various groups and fostering discrimination between them. Some of these conflicts still exist today. Under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, Russia expressed a nostalgic view of the Soviet era, considering its dissolution as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. This sentiment fueled a revival of Russian nationalism and irredentism, influencing Russia's military interventions in Chechnya in 1999 and 2000, Georgia in 2008, and Ukraine in 2014, which included the illegal annexation of Crimea. Most recently, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 escalated these tensions further, underlining ongoing disputes across the post-Soviet space. Thus, while the dissolution of the Soviet Union marked the end of a centralized communist regime and colonial aspirations within the former republics, it also unleashed an enduring legacy of territorial disputes, ethnic tensions, and geopolitical rivalries that continue to shape the region's dynamics today. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. There are many more coming at Study of War.